When we speak of self-improvement today, we must recognize that we are witnessing a cultural phenomenon unprecedented in history. Never before has humanity been so inundated with teachings, techniques, and promises of transformation. And yet, paradoxically, never before have so many individuals felt so profoundly stuck, fragmented, and internally divided. This contradiction should alert us to something deeper than mere failure of discipline or lack of willpower. It points to a psychological tension within the modern psyche itself. For many, the pursuit of self-improvement has not become a journey toward wholeness, but a flight from the inner world. People accumulate teachings the way others collect possessions, imagining that the sheer quantity of advice will compensate for the absence of genuine inner integration. But the unconscious does not respond to accumulation. The unconscious responds only to sincerity, to confrontation, to transformation, born of conflict and self-honesty. And so we find a strange dynamic emerging. Individuals who are constantly learning yet never becoming, constantly inspired yet inwardly fragmented. One must understand that the danger is not self-improvement itself, but the unconscious motives behind it. When self-improvement becomes a mask, a persona adopted to hide insecurity, fear, or unresolved shadow, it ceases to liberate the individual. Instead, it becomes another chain that binds him. The modern person is not suffering from a lack of information. He is suffering from an excess of unassimilated experience, from the absence of self-reflection, from the refusal to descend into the depths where true change is initiated. And so the dark side of self-improvement arises when the individual externalizes what should be internal, substitutes appearance for authenticity, and confuses activity with transformation. To improve the self without understanding the self is a contradiction. And a contradiction in the psyche breeds anxiety, confusion, and stagnation. If we are to move toward genuine growth, we must begin not with more techniques, but with a more honest dialogue with our own inner world. Not with another list of habits, but with the courage to ask, what part of me seeks improvement and what part resists it? What am I trying to perfect and what am I trying to avoid? Only then does the path toward genuine integration open before us. When we consider the first trap of modern self-improvement, what we may call inspiration addiction, we must examine a subtle but profound psychological mechanism. The contemporary individual is exposed to an endless stream of motivational messages, stirring speeches, and emotional catalysts. These fragments of inspiration, though seemingly uplifting, often function as psychic stimulants rather than agents of transformation. They excite the surface of consciousness but leave the deeper layers of the psyche untouched. In many ways, inspiration has become the modern equivalent of a narcotic. It produces a momentary sense of elevation, a fleeting impression of clarity and purpose. Yet, like all stimulants, it requires constant renewal. The individual returns repeatedly to the same sources, not because transformation has occurred, but because it has not occurred. The unconscious remains unaddressed, the shadow remains untouched. And so one seeks again and again the emotional high that temporarily masks the inner discord. It is important to understand that the psyche does not evolve through constant excitation. True development arises from tension, conflict, and confrontation with the hidden and often painful aspects of oneself. But inspiration, in its addictive form, allows the individual to bypass this necessary struggle. It creates the illusion of progress while the unconscious remains unchanged. It is a bright light shining upon the surface of the water, never penetrating its depths. This addiction is strengthened by a cultural myth, the belief that emotion equals transformation. But emotion is only the wind that stirs the surface. Transformation requires the descent into the unconscious, the integration of the shadow, and the difficult labor of self-honesty. Without this, inspiration becomes a form of self-deception, a beautiful mask worn over unresolved fear and inner fragmentation. Thus we must ask, do we seek inspiration because we are ready to change, or because we are desperate to avoid the pain of changing? To break this cycle, one must first recognize the psychological comfort that inspiration provides. Then one must turn inward and face the less glamorous, but far more necessary task: the slow, often uncomfortable integration of one's own inner contradictions. Only when inspiration ignites action that reshapes the inner world does it serve its true purpose. Otherwise, it merely sedates the psyche, leaving the real work undone. The second trap, which I refer to as the classroom prison, arises not from a lack of knowledge, but from an excess of unassimilated information. In our time, the individual has unprecedented access to teachings, books, and systems promising development. Yet this abundance creates a peculiar psychological dilemma: the illusion that understanding is equivalent to becoming. It is an illusion that has seduced many into a passive form of growth that occurs only in the intellect, while the deeper personality remains untouched. You see, knowledge that is not lived becomes a burden to the psyche. It forms a repository of ideals and principles that the individual admires but does not embody. And this gap between what one knows and what one actually is produces a subtle but persistent fragmentation. The ego becomes inflated with theories, yet the shadow remains neglected. The intellect advances, while the soul stands still. And because the individual senses this inner discrepancy, he consumes even more knowledge in an attempt to fill the void, creating a cycle that tightens like a psychological trap. This is why I say, many people are not learning, they are escaping. They hide behind books and lectures to avoid confronting the very experiences that could reveal their true nature. They increase their intellectual vocabulary in order to avoid emotional confrontation. Their bookshelf becomes a fortress protecting them from their own unconscious. In this sense, the classroom becomes a prison not because learning is harmful, but because learning becomes a substitute for integration. We must remember that the psyche is not transformed by ideas alone. It is transformed when ideas are confronted, tested, and embodied. To read about discipline is not the same as becoming disciplined. To study courage is not the same as confronting fear. To understand the shadow is not the same as integrating it. The unconscious is unmoved by intellectual admiration. It is moved only by lived experience. Thus the great question becomes, what part of me fears taking these ideas into life? Perhaps it is the ego, afraid to lose control. Perhaps it is the shadow, afraid to be exposed. Or perhaps it is the child within, afraid to fail. In any case, the only remedy is action, not dramatic action, but the quiet, sincere application of one principle at a time. For when action and knowledge unite, the psyche begins to reorganize itself around new realities. The individual feels grounded rather than inflated. Ideas cease to be ornaments and become the raw material of character. And this marks the true end of the classroom prison. When knowledge ceases to be an escape and becomes a mirror through which one must finally meet oneself. When we speak of the mental factory, we are referring to one of the most fundamental truths of the psyche. The mind becomes what it repeatedly absorbs. This was known intuitively by ancient thinkers, expressed in myths and symbols long before psychology existed. And yet today, this truth is violated more violently and more frequently than ever before. Modern individuals allow their consciousness to be flooded with impressions that are chaotic, fragmented, and often deeply toxic without recognizing that every impression, every word, every image leaves a trace within the unconscious. One must understand, the psyche is not a passive container. It is an alchemical vessel. Whatever enters the psyche undergoes transformation, and whatever is transformed within it becomes part of the individual's inner world. So when the mind is filled with triviality, gossip, outrage, and superficial stimulation, these elements do not simply vanish after consumption, they descend into the unconscious, where they shape mood, perception, and even personality. Here lies the third trap of modern self-improvement, the belief that one can pursue inner growth while simultaneously allowing one's mental environment to be polluted. This is the contradiction of the age. A person reads a profound book in the morning, then spends the afternoon ingesting content that contradicts everything that book attempted to cultivate. The psyche becomes a battlefield of competing impulses, and the individual wonders why clarity, purpose, and self-respect remain elusive. To make matters worse, the unconscious does not distinguish between serious content and entertainment. Everything that enters the psyche is material for psychic formation. When a person immerses themselves in sensationalism, fear-based narratives, or idealized images of others' lives, the unconscious absorbs these impressions as if they were part of reality. This produces anxiety, envy, confusion, and a gradual erosion of self-worth. The individual is not aware of why he suffers because the process occurs beneath consciousness, in the depths where impressions blend and reorganize into attitudes. In symbolic language, we might say, the modern mind has allowed its sacred temple to become a marketplace. Voices shout from every direction, and the individual no longer knows which voice is his own. The self, the organizing principle of the psyche, cannot emerge in an environment of constant noise. Silence is its native soil. Reflection is its atmosphere. Depth is its nourishment. Therefore, the central question becomes, what are you feeding your psyche each day? Are you offering it material from which it can build meaning, or are you giving it fragments that create only confusion? Are you feeding the higher possibilities of your nature, or nourishing only your fears, impulses, and insecurities? To purify one's mental environment is not an act of luxury, it is an act of psychological survival. The psyche requires protection just as the body requires nourishment. If one does not consciously stand guard at the door of the mind, as Jim Rohn expressed it, the unconscious becomes a dumping ground rather than a sanctuary. True inner growth begins when one takes responsibility for what enters the psyche, when one becomes selective, disciplined, and thoughtful about the impressions they allow to shape their inner world. Only then can the unconscious begin to reorganize itself around clarity rather than chaos, around authenticity rather than imitation, around wholeness rather than fragmentation. And this is the great task, to restore the inner world to a place of order, silence, and meaning so that the deeper voice of the self may be heard again. The fourth trap, constant comparison, is one of the most destructive psychological patterns of our era. Although comparison is not a modern invention, modern technology has amplified it to such an extreme that many individuals can no longer distinguish between their own inner voice and the fragmented images of others' lives presented before them. This relentless comparison has created a crisis of identity, one more profound than it first appears. To understand this trap, we must examine the nature of the psyche itself. The psyche seeks orientation, an inner center around which one's life can be organized. But when the individual does not possess a strong connection to this inner center, the self, he begins to orient himself around external figures and projections. He looks outward, not inward. He shapes his aspirations based on what others appear to have achieved, rather than what his own nature demands of him. This outward orientation is the seed of comparison, and comparison, at its core, is a conflict between the ego's idealized image and the reality of the individual's lived experience. The ego, confronted with curated images of other people's achievements, feels inadequate and inferior. But this feeling is not a reflection of truth, it is a reflection of projection. One does not see the other's struggles, doubts, failures, or shadows. One sees only the polished mask, and the ego compares its own unfiltered inner chaos with the perfected images of others. The result is a painful distortion. The tragedy of comparison is that it separates the individual from his own path. Instead of listening to the quiet promptings of the inner world, he listens to the loud signals of the outer world. Instead of unfolding his unique pattern of becoming, he attempts to replicate the patterns of others. The more he compares, the more he loses contact with the self, which alone can provide genuine purpose and direction. This phenomenon is not merely emotional, it is symbolic. It reflects a deeper archetypal struggle, the struggle between the authentic self and the persona, the social mask one presents to the world. Modern comparison culture strengthens the persona and weakens the self. It urges individuals to become more likable, more impressive, more polished, rather than more whole. And when the persona grows too large, the individual becomes alienated from his own inner life. What appears as envy or insecurity on the surface is in fact a symptom of inner disconnection. Thus the question becomes, to whom are you comparing yourself, and why? Is it truly admiration of another's path, or a projection of your own unclaimed potential? Is the comparison revealing your inferiority, or is it revealing a fear of pursuing your own destiny? The cure for comparison is not withdrawal from the world. It is the reclamation of one's inner center. When the individual reconnects with the self, when he recognizes that his life has its own rhythm, its own symbolism, its own path of unfolding comparison loses its power, one no longer needs to measure oneself against others. Because one has returned to the only measure that matters, the alignment between one's life and one's own inner truth. In this way, the end of comparison marks the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming who one was always meant to be. One of the most subtle and treacherous traps in modern self-improvement is the creation of what I call the fantasy identity. It is the version of oneself that exists only in imagination, an idealized figure projected into the future, perfected in discipline, clarity, and purpose, yet never embodied in the present moment. This image often serves as a psychological refuge, protecting the individual from confronting the imperfections, fears, and contradictions of his current state. To understand this trap, we must recognize the nature of the ego. The ego strives for coherence and superiority. When reality challenges its ambition through failure, inconsistency, or self-doubt, the ego constructs a fantasy that restores its sense of importance. This future self becomes a symbolic compensation for the unresolved aspects of the psyche. It promises redemption without struggle, transformation without sacrifice. In many individuals, this fantasy identity becomes more cherished than the real self. They speak endlessly of their future discipline, their future achievements, their future greatness. But these declarations often conceal a profound avoidance, the unwillingness to engage with the present self, the one who is fragmented, uncertain, and wounded. The fantasy is perfect because it has never been tested. The present self is imperfect because it is the one engaged in the real work of existence. This psychological mechanism resembles what the ancients understood as a form of spiritual inflation. The individual imagines himself rising above his current limits, yet he has not confronted the shadow that anchors those limits. He seeks transcendence without integration. And so the greater the fantasy becomes, the more painful the reality appears. The gulf between the imagined self and the lived self widens, creating anxiety, shame, and paralysis. The danger is that the fantasy identity feels like progress. It gives the illusion of motion. One imagines a new diet, a new business, a new routine, a new life, and these fantasies produce emotional satisfaction. But this satisfaction is deceptive, for it replaces action. It drains the energy that should be directed toward confronting the unconscious and reshaping one's actual behavior. The individual becomes intoxicated with potential while neglecting development. We must remember that the psyche is not healed by idealized images. It is healed by the confrontation with reality. Jung wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain, and indeed the painful encounter with one's present limitations is the threshold through which true growth begins. The fantasy identity avoids this pain, and therefore it prevents consciousness from expanding. So we must ask ourselves, what part of me constructs this future ideal? What fear or inadequacy is it shielding me from? What shadow does this fantasy prevent me from meeting? The path to authenticity requires that we collapse the distance between who we imagine ourselves to be and who we truly are in this moment. Only when the fantasy dissolves can the real work begin. The individual must accept that transformation occurs not in the future, but in the present through small, often uncomfortable acts of integration. The heroic figure one imagines becoming is not reached by dreaming more vividly, but by engaging courageously with one's immediate reality. Thus, the antidote to the fantasy identity is simple yet profound. Bring your attention back to the present self, the only self capable of transformation. Embrace its imperfections. Engage its fears. Integrate its shadow. Only then does the individual cease to chase an illusion and begin to embody a destiny. The sixth trap we encounter in the modern pursuit of self-improvement is the overwhelming excess of external guidance, which I have termed the overload problem. We live in an age where it is not uncommon for an individual to follow dozens, if not hundreds, of mentors, gurus, and influencers, all offering competing systems of thought, strategies for success, and pathways to inner peace. This flood of advice is alluring, promising that a new voice or a new method will provide the key to unlocking one's true potential. But while the mind is distracted by this cacophony of voices, it loses touch with its own inner wisdom and with the deep, solitary work of mastery. The psyche is not meant to be pulled in countless directions at once. When the individual is constantly exposed to a multiplicity of external authorities, each calling for action in a different direction, the ego becomes fragmented. It seeks to adhere to everything without truly committing to anything. The result is a lack of depth and a pervasive feeling of inadequacy. No matter how many strategies are consumed, the individual never feels good enough because the depth required for true growth is sacrificed on the altar of variety. This excess of guidance, this endless accumulation of solutions does not lead to mastery. Instead, it feeds into a deeper insecurity, a fear that perhaps I am missing something, or perhaps there is a better way. And so, the individual becomes a perpetual student, never truly engaging in the application of his learning. He is constantly learning, but never mastering. He is gathering knowledge, but never integrating it into his being. From a psychological perspective, this is a form of externalization. The individual looks outside of himself for answers, rather than turning inward to the deep well of the unconscious. He entrusts his growth to external voices, rather than developing his own inner authority. This creates a situation where the ego becomes a passive recipient of advice, rather than an active agent of its own evolution. The individual thus becomes more fragmented, less certain of his own path, and further removed from the self. The reality of mastery, however, is different. Mastery requires singular focus, the deep work of integration, and the courage to make mistakes and learn from them. The true mentor, in the Jungian sense, is not someone whose voice drowns out all others, but someone who helps guide the individual back to his own inner compass. The goal is not to acquire more information, but to distill and integrate what resonates with one's authentic self. In the words of Jung himself, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is the task: to stop fleeing from the darkness of uncertainty, inadequacy, and imperfection, and to begin integrating it into the personality. The more mentors an individual follows without such integration, the more he externalizes his own authority. And in doing so, he places the key to his growth in the hands of others, not within himself. The solution to the overload problem is deceptively simple. Commit to one voice, one path, one discipline, until you have lived it. There is no magic in variety. There is power in depth. The depth of a single idea, truly mastered, can transform an entire life, whereas the shallow dabbling in many ideas leads only to confusion and dissatisfaction. It is essential that we stop externalizing our growth and instead turn inward, recognizing that all true mastery arises from the integration of what we already know. The wisdom we need is not scattered in 1,000 voices, but exists within our own unconscious, waiting to be recognized and actualized. The seventh and perhaps most insidious trap in the pursuit of self-improvement is the illusion of control, a condition closely tied to what we call perfectionism. Perfectionism is not merely a striving for excellence, it is a pathological desire to master the uncontrollable aspects of life, to impose an artificial order upon the inherent chaos of existence. In the ego's attempt to escape the discomfort of uncertainty and imperfection, it constructs a false image of the self as one who has everything figured out, one who is always in control, always flawless, always perfect. But this desire for control, this compulsion to perfect every detail, is ultimately self-destructive. It creates a barrier between the individual and the unconscious, for the unconscious thrives in the realm of paradox, mystery, and spontaneity. It does not respond to rigid control, nor can it be tamed by the perfectionism of the ego. The more the ego seeks to dominate the inner world with its ideals, the more it isolates itself from the truth of the psyche. The self, which encompasses the totality of the individual, cannot be confined to neat categories or fixed ideals. It is a living, dynamic force, constantly shifting, growing, and integrating new aspects of experience. Perfectionism is a defense against the unknown, a way of avoiding the anxiety that arises when we confront our limitations, our failures, and our flaws. The ego, in its frantic desire for control, demands that life conform to a rigid set of rules and expectations, and when life inevitably falls short of those expectations, the ego responds with shame, self-criticism, and despair. This creates an endless cycle of self-punishment, where the individual feels perpetually inadequate because they cannot meet their own unattainable standards. But the reality is that perfection is an illusion. There is no such thing as a perfectly controlled life, a flawless self, or a perfectly balanced psyche. Life itself is filled with contradictions, uncertainties, and mistakes. The shadow, the part of ourselves we repress and deny, cannot be perfected. It must be integrated. And this integration happens not through control, but through acceptance, through the acknowledgement of the parts of ourselves we wish to avoid. The antidote to perfectionism, therefore, lies in the acceptance of imperfection. This is not a resignation to failure, but a recognition that imperfection is part of the human condition. It is a recognition that to be fully alive is to be in constant tension with the unconscious, with the unknown, with the parts of ourselves we have yet to understand. It is through this tension, this acceptance of our flaws and limitations, that true growth occurs. Perfection is the enemy of wisdom, for wisdom arises when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, to be fallible, to make mistakes, without shaming ourselves for them. In this sense, the perfectionist is caught in a trap of his own making. He cannot live fully because he demands perfection from himself and from life. He becomes like the alchemist who seeks to turn base metal into gold but loses sight of the real work, the work of transmutation within the self. The alchemical process is not one of perfecting a substance, but of embracing the full range of the material in its raw state, and through this process, discovering a deeper, more authentic reality. Thus we must ask ourselves, what am I trying to control in my life? What aspect of myself am I afraid to confront? What part of me believes I must be perfect to be worthy? True self-improvement is not about achieving an idealized version of oneself, but about embracing the whole of the self, the strengths and weaknesses, the successes and failures. It is about recognizing that growth occurs in the tension between what is and what could be, and that this tension, when properly embraced, is the source of true power. The real cure for perfectionism is not striving for flawlessness, but embracing the imperfections within us all. To live authentically is to allow the unconscious to guide us, to learn from our mistakes, and to accept that life's unpredictability is not a burden, but a source of creative potential. Now, let us turn our attention to perhaps the most insidious and often unnoticed force that undermines personal growth, the unconscious saboteur. This is the shadow aspect of the self, which manifests as self-doubt and a deep-seated fear of success. It is not the fear of failure that paralyzes us most. It is often the unconscious fear of success that lurks behind our hesitation, our procrastination, and our self-sabotaging behavior. Self-doubt is an essential part of the human experience. It is the voice that asks, am I good enough? And can I truly achieve this? But when left unchecked, this doubt becomes the unconscious saboteur that stands between us and our potential. It is not merely a passive fear, it is an active force that seeks to maintain the status quo, to keep us small, and to prevent us from stepping into our true power. It is a fear that says, success will require too much of you. It will demand more than you are willing to give. It will change who you are, and who you are might not be enough. What is at the heart of this fear? It is an unconscious belief that success is somehow dangerous, that stepping into the fullness of our potential will disrupt the delicate balance of our inner world. This belief is deeply rooted in early experiences, in the messages we received as children, in the ways we were taught to relate to ourselves and to the world. The unconscious tells us that success will bring not only external rewards, but also internal conflict, because it will expose us to the parts of ourselves we have yet to integrate. The truth is that success can indeed be threatening. It can awaken the shadow, the parts of ourselves we have repressed, the aspects of our psyche we have rejected because they are too frightening, too ambitious, too powerful. Success can bring with it a loss of control, a dissolution of the familiar self-image. We may fear that with success comes the unraveling of our identity, the collapse of the persona we have built to protect ourselves from the chaos of the unconscious. Thus, self-doubt is not merely a reflection of insecurity. It is a defense mechanism, a means of protecting the ego from the overwhelming forces of the unconscious. The ego, in its need to maintain control, sabotages our progress by planting seeds of doubt, whispering that we are not capable, that we will fail, that success is not for people like us. It works tirelessly to keep us within the boundaries of the known, the comfortable, and the safe, even if that means keeping us stuck. But we must ask, what is the deeper truth behind this self-doubt? What parts of myself am I hiding from? What aspects of my shadow am I avoiding? The key to overcoming this self-sabotage is to confront the shadow directly, to acknowledge the parts of ourselves we have denied, and to integrate them into the conscious self. Self-doubt often arises from an unconscious fragmentation, from the refusal to accept the fullness of who we are. When we reject our own power, our own brilliance, we create the conditions for doubt to take root. But when we accept ourselves, imperfections, fears, and all, we find that the shadow no longer has the power to control us. Success is not an external event. It is an internal shift. It is the moment when we stop seeing ourselves as limited beings and begin to recognize that we have the potential to live authentically, to be fully who we are, without fear of what that will mean. When we step into our true power, the unconscious begins to align with our conscious intentions, and self-doubt dissolves. No longer are we divided between who we are and who we are meant to be. We become integrated. We become whole. The unconscious saboteur's greatest weapon is the belief that we are not worthy of success. It feeds on the idea that success is a burden, that it will bring more pain than pleasure. But the truth is that success, when it is the result of authentic growth, brings with it peace, not conflict. It brings the freedom to be ourselves, to express our creativity, and to live in alignment with our deepest values. Thus, the path forward requires a radical acceptance of the self, both the conscious and unconscious aspects. It requires a willingness to step into the unknown, to embrace the discomfort that comes with change, and to face the fears that have held us back for so long. Only then can we silence the saboteur and begin to live fully, without hesitation, without doubt, and without fear of the very success that we have the power to create. As we arrive at the final trap in our exploration, we come to what may be the most revealing pattern of all, the complaint syndrome, a subtle but pervasive psychological habit rooted in the desire for external validation. Complaining, though seemingly harmless on the surface, is in fact a symbolic dialogue with the outer world, a way of saying, see me, understand me, confirm my suffering so that I may feel justified in my stagnation. It is the ego's attempt to find refuge from responsibility by projecting its inner conflicts onto circumstances, people, or fate itself. Complaining is a displacement of inner tension. It allows the individual to redirect the discomfort of self-confrontation outward onto the world. Instead of acknowledging the shadow, those aspects of oneself that require integration, the individual dramatizes the injustices of life, the failures of others, or the obstacles placed before him. This externalization momentarily relieves the burden of introspection, but at the cost of one's potential, for every complaint is a relinquishing of power. Every complaint reinforces the illusion that change must come from outside rather than from within. Psychologically, The complaint syndrome represents a fragmentation between the ego and the unconscious. The ego, threatened by the task of self-responsibility, seeks allies in the external world. It invites sympathy, validation, and agreement from others, hoping that their approval will soothe the inner conflict. But this comfort is illusory. It does not resolve the tension within the psyche, it merely anesthetizes it. And like all emotional anesthetics, it requires constant replenishment. The deeper tragedy is that the individual becomes dependent on the world for a sense of worth. He becomes like the child seeking the parent's reassurance, unable to stand securely on his own inner foundation. The psyche then orients itself around the reactions of others rather than around its own truth. And so one's life becomes reactive rather than creative, shaped by external affirmation rather than by inner necessity. We must understand that complaining is not merely about expressing dissatisfaction. It is a symbolic act that reveals a profound psychological need, the need to feel innocent rather than responsible, the need to be seen rather than to see oneself, the need to be comforted rather than challenged. But true individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires that we relinquish these needs. It requires that we confront the shadow directly, that we accept responsibility for our condition, and that we cease seeking validation from others. For when we stop complaining, something extraordinary occurs. The energy that was once directed toward blame becomes available for transformation. The individual begins to recognize that circumstances are not the ultimate determinants of his life. What matters is how he relates to these circumstances, how he interprets them, integrates them, and uses them for growth. Complaining keeps the psyche in a state of stasis. Responsibility sets it in motion. Thus, the path out of the complaint syndrome is fundamentally a shift of orientation from outward projection to inward reflection. One must ask not, why is life doing this to me? But rather, what is life asking of me? Not, why are others failing me? But, what part of myself have I neglected to develop? This shift marks the beginning of self-mastery, the moment when the individual recognizes that external validation can never replace inner affirmation. To cease complaining is to reclaim authorship of one's life. It is to declare that one's destiny is not governed by external forces, but by the unfolding of the inner self. And when the individual steps into this truth, he no longer seeks to be understood by the world. He seeks instead to understand himself. And from this understanding arises a deeper authenticity, a more grounded presence, and a capacity to face life with courage rather than resignation. Throughout this exploration of the 9 traps, we have seen that the true danger of modern self-improvement is not in its teachings, but in the unconscious motives that distort its purpose. Each trap reveals a deeper psychological conflict: the inflation of the ego, the avoidance of the shadow, the fragmentation of identity, the flight from responsibility, and the abandonment of the inner self in favor of external illusions. The path forward is not the accumulation of more techniques, nor the perfection of the persona. It is the courage to confront the unconscious, to integrate the shadow, and to live from the center of one's being. True self-improvement is not a pursuit of superiority, but a movement toward wholeness. It is the acceptance of one's imperfections, the integration of one's contradictions, and the unfolding of one's own destiny, not the imitation of another's. And so I leave you with this final thought. The greatest journey is not toward a better version of yourself, but toward the self you have always been beneath the noise. If you have the courage to walk that path, you will find that growth is not something you chase. It is something you become.